Okay, great. We'll begin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is a really exciting moment for the Science-Based Targets Network. Last week at the Seafood Expo in Boston, the Ocean Hub, led by WWF and Conservation International, I'm joined by our two hub leads here, announced the first ever ocean science-based targets with initial focus on the seafood sector. You can go ahead and get started to the next slide, please. Great. I'm Varsha Vijay, SBTN's Technical Director, and I'm joined today by Alice Thomas-Smyth, the WWF lead for the Ocean Hub, and Taylor Witkin, who's the CI lead for the Ocean Hub. Okay, so to give a little bit of an introduction into SBTN, I'm sure many of you are already aware of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI. For those that aren't, SBTI is the initiative for companies setting and implementing science-based targets for climate. There may be even some organizations on this webinar that have already set science-based targets or in the process of doing so, and the momentum for science-based targets in general and science-based targets for climate is increasing, with over 7,000 companies that have already set science-based targets for climate. However, we don't want to stop there. Science-Based Targets Network, or SBTN, builds off of the work of SBTI on climate to create target-setting methods to address environmental impacts, reflecting the fact that climate is inextricably linked to all aspects of nature. We really can't address the dual crises of climate change and nature loss without taking credible action on nature. And that's not just because of the critical importance of nature for addressing climate impacts, with the importance of the absorption of climate emissions by nature, but also because nature is the foundation of our economy and of our lives through business dependencies and critical ecosystem services. At the Science-Based Targets Network, we provide an integrated approach for companies to address their environmental impacts. So that means we address these key areas of nature: freshwater, land, ocean, and biodiversity. These complement the efforts by SBTI to guide companies' actions on climate. By using this holistic, integrated approach across these different areas of nature, our goal is to enable companies to take enough of the right actions in the right places at the right time to do their part to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. And we do this using the power of our network. That's a really key part of the way we work at SBTN. We're not just an organization, we're a network. And our credibility is partially coming from this. It's a coalition of key environmental organizations, and we're driven by a consensus-led approach, drawing from the best available science to build our guidance, rather than just leading with one organization. So as we mentioned with SBTI, we have some of the same founding partners as SBTI, plus additional ones that help us more fully address the work that we are doing across the dimensions of nature and biodiversity. We have a coalition of over 80 environmental organizations, nonprofits, as well as mission-driven organizations to do this work. That ensures our credibility and very firm scientific foundation, drawing on deep expertise across all the experts that work with us. Please. So we often get the question, like, why science-based targets? For those that are familiar with the seafood space and other corporate sustainability, you might be thinking that companies are already setting some type of target, but there are some really important distinguishing factors between some of those targets and the build that Science-Based Targets does in our methodology. It really helps strengthen corporate action and further mitigate risk and increase resiliency. To highlight some of the examples, these targets are ambitious and quantifiable. So these aren't directional commitments. Instead, they define precisely how much action is needed based on quantitative thresholds aligned with Earth's limits and societal sustainability goals. So To be very clear about what defines a science-based target, it is something that is measurable, time-bound, and actionable, and in this case, tied to ecological and biophysical thresholds. So we had a recent study by World Benchmarking Alliance that showed that only 1% of companies without specific measurable targets achieved impacts, while nearly 60% of those with quantitative targets made progress towards these goals, which tells us how important this approach is. Additionally, the target setting process is rigorous and it's strategic. So even companies that want to act may not know what is good enough and can end up setting ad hoc qualitative targets without a cohesive environmental business strategy. Science-based targets provide a structure to that with rigorous science-driven framework to guide companies through a clear and strategic decision-making process, ensuring that the targets are rooted in data, aligned with environmental risks and opportunities, and providing companies with the confidence to integrate them into business planning. These targets are also globally recognized, credible, and independently validated. Science-based targets can help companies address increasing stakeholder scrutiny, including from financial institutions, regulators, and customers. They provide a globally recognized standardized framework that ensures consistency and comparability in corporate target setting. As we already mentioned, they're backed by civil society and also independently validated by our validation host. We'll go into that a little bit more. The Accountability Accelerator, which ensures legitimacy and accountability. And finally, as I also mentioned, these are comprehensive. The SBTN approach requires companies to assess their impacts across the value chain and then across dimensions of nature. And we'll focus a little bit more on how we've sequenced that to make it easier for companies to have this holistic assessment. So they're working across their value chain, across freshwater, land, and ocean before they're setting targets, with an inclusion of upstream supply chains where much of the company's nature impacts may exist. And that ensures that actions are based on a complete understanding of their impacts. Targets are also supporting corporate reporting structures. These targets are helping companies prepare for voluntary and regulatory frameworks such as TNFD, CSRD. The Ocean Hub has done a lot of work to show that alignment with other initiatives more broadly and specifically in the seafood space. And a key characteristic of our approach is that the targets we're talking about are location-specific and time-bound. So that idea of being location or spatially explicit is incredibly important because a single broad target for an entire company may not drive the right actions in the right places, as we talked about. Science-based target ensures alignment with the geographic and temporal dimensions of nature action, a critical differentiator from what we're talking about in terms of climate action, helping companies prioritize where and when to act for their maximum impact. So having talked about the kind of holistic approach and value of science-based targets, I'll go through how we do this. And we use a 5-step approach. We've designed a process that builds on existing corporate practices and takes companies all the way from assessing their impacts on nature in their step 1 throughout their value chains, identifying which parts of their business and locations they should prioritize in step 2, and setting targets in step 3, which you'll hear a lot more about with the new ocean science-based targets. And then finally, to implementing actions to meet them in step 4 and tracking progress against them in step 5, which are guidance to come yet. And it's important to keep in mind that this is an iterative process for companies. Though companies are going to progress in this kind of sequential order, they'll need to go back and refresh these assessments and learn over time. And we've already heard from companies some benefits to this process. You'll see up on the screen here some quotes from companies who have used our method through our initial validation pilot. And just to give a couple of characteristic examples here, these methods helped Alpro, a plant-based food company, move from incremental improvements to targets they're confident are good enough for the planet. This process also helped another food company, Nestle, better respond to nature-related risks across the value chain. It helped Wholesome, a building solutions company, advise give credibility from the robust methodology. So that's an example of kind of building the robustness and credibility of the work that they've done on nature. And the targets give GSK, a pharmaceutical company, increased traceability and transparency through the supply chain. Finally, Bell, another food company, appreciated the rigor of the targets, which serve as a foundation for corporate reporting through EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and disclosure recommendations through the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. So they set them up for success. And moving from these discrete examples and testimonials from key companies who have utilized our methodologies, corporate momentum is building. Over 150 companies are preparing to set targets through our corporate engagement program. And on conclusion of our year-long validation pilot that I mentioned, with 17 companies, 10 companies have had their targets validated, and 3 have publicly disclosed those targets: GSK, Kering, and Wholesome. We have corporate representation in over 30 companies and 5 active regional working groups helping to deepen engagement. We've also launched programs with the Japanese and French governments who are looking to accelerate credible action on nature through science-based targets for nature. But as we talk about the comprehensiveness, scope, and rigor of our methods, the process can feel a little bit intimidating, but actually getting started is easier than it looks, and we encourage action by creating flexibility for companies as they progress, which they can actually publicize while ensuring accountability through our claims guidance. To provide some examples of how we do that, we have a business unit approach that allows companies to focus on the target setting process only on some parts of the organization rather than the entire enterprise, when not all parts of the business might be equally ready to set targets. For example, that could be due to value chain data. We also allow intermediate milestones for claims. So when companies have had their materiality assessment and prioritization steps validated by the Accountability Accelerator, our independent validation host, they can publicly announce this initial checkpoint as part of their journey toward science-based targets. There's currently no time expectation to move forward, though we always hope that companies will use the most comprehensive and rigorous version of our methods as they move forward. Companies can also set targets in just one area, for example, ocean, even if that company has impacts across land, freshwater as well. So that means we hope they'll do all of it, but they can get started with a subset. So each claim is going to be strictly limited to the related adopted target and reported on the validation tracker. So that could be that the company takes on target setting for particular stocks within their fisheries, and they move forward to more comprehensively address their environmental impacts. Companies can also focus their value chain assessment on a set of key economic activities and commodities. That's something that the methodology enables them to do by highlighting particularly high impact commodities. And companies can prioritize action in areas where traceability is already available while simultaneously working to improve traceability across their value chain. So hopefully this gives you a great idea of how SBTN as a holistic piece of work can help companies move forward. And I'll turn over to Taylor, who's going to walk us through the first ocean science-based targets. Taylor?
Thanks, Varsha. Hi, everyone. My name's Taylor Witkin. I work for Conservation International, and I'm one of the co-leads of the Ocean Hub alongside Alice, who you will hear from in a few minutes. I first just want to thank our funders, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation for their support of this work over the last couple of years. So over the last 2 years, we've used SBTN methodology to create guidance that will enable companies to set science-based targets to address nature and biodiversity loss in the ocean. And so we're excited to announce the launch of the first version of those targets, developed for the seafood sector to address 3 primary drivers of nature loss: overexploitation of wild seafood stocks, harm to marine habitats, and threats that fishing and aquaculture poses to endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife. The Ocean Hub is led by CI and WWF and is supported by an excellent steering committee made of the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, Fishwise, TNC, Marine Stewardship Council, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and the UN Environment Program's Finance Initiative. Also, big thank you to Klaus de Vos at Ocean Fox Advisory for his support of this work. Last summer, we piloted this guidance with 4 companies that occupy different positions in the supply chain. And we also completed a public consultation and expert panel review before making revisions and publishing this guidance last week. So thank you to everyone that weighed in on earlier drafts of this methodology. First, I want to acknowledge that this guidance enters a robust ecosystem of sustainability frameworks and certifications in the seafood space. The purpose of SBTN seafood guidance is not to replace or compete with anything that's out there and is currently being used by the seafood industry. We develop these targets to really complement existing efforts and to expand the scope and pace of action in the places and the supply chains where action is needed the most. By setting science-based targets, companies can proactively address their impacts on nature, not just by reducing and avoiding harm, but by engaging in ecosystems that they depend on to hopefully create positive conservation outcomes, which should then feed back into their supply chains, creating a more resilient seafood system. This is a standardized approach that can ensure consistent and comparable target setting across the sector. And we also think it has potential to be used in pre-competitive collaborations, because while companies should be responsible for addressing the specific pressure that they're putting on nature, it's really going to take that collective action to actually make a difference in the water. And this is something that we're actually already seeing with SBTN's land and freshwater targets. Recently, the Textile Exchange, which convenes the fashion, textile, and apparel industry on collective climate and nature-related action, published its own guidance on implementing step 3 of science-based targets for nature within the textile industry. Our guidance can also enhance corporate disclosure and regulatory alignment, and it enables companies to integrate their target setting approach across supply chains and geographies. So ideally, companies could be setting targets across land, freshwater, and oceans, if that makes sense for their supply chains. This guidance is meant for any company with seafood in their supply chains, from producers all the way to retailers, and covers both aquaculture and wild capture seafood. The targets may be applied differently using different pathways, depending on the type of seafood and the position that a company occupies in the supply chain. Companies will determine if ocean targets apply to them through the materiality assessment in step 1. And then they'll determine which targets, assuming they are using Ocean Hub methodology, which targets will apply when they get to step 3. I also want to point out that for farmed seafood, companies may find that land and freshwater targets also apply to them, depending on their operations and sourcing practices. For example, if aquaculture feed is derived from agriculture, or a farm is land-based and uses recirculating aquaculture, and therefore has to consider water consumption and discharge, land or freshwater targets may be applicable. So what does the target setting process look like? Each of the targets requires companies to identify and interpret the best available data to ensure that their operations and sourcing practices align with scientifically defined thresholds. A set of indicators are used to understand the current state of nature in the ocean relative to those thresholds and the desired conditions in marine ecosystems. These indicators provide insights into stock and population health, habitat health, and the extent of human impact. They define the maximum level of pressure ecosystems can withstand. Within each target is a set of pathways that is determined by a company's position in the supply chain and the state of nature relative to the thresholds for each target. Once a company has determined the pathways that they'll use, they apply the data to calculate and set targets that are specific to their business practices and sourcing locations. This will result in a set of target statements that they will submit alongside the data that they've gathered to the Accountability Accelerator for validation. Target 1, avoid and reduce overexploitation, focuses on wild fisheries, helping companies avoid reliance on overexploited stocks and encouraging engagement in efforts to improve stocks, the health of stocks in places that companies are sourcing from. 4 pathways for this target will result in 4 distinct types of action: reduction in sourcing from an overexploited stock, a cap on sourcing, so maintaining sourcing at current levels and not increasing it, a commitment to cease sourcing from an overexploited stock, or engagement with the goal of supporting efforts to improve stock health for the relevant seafood type. As I mentioned, target pathways are based on stock status and fishing pressure relative to the threshold of maximum sustainable yield. Due to the complex nature of fisheries management and long timeframes often needed for stock recovery, the pathways are designed to be iterative. So companies may end up setting a series of targets over a 10 or 15-year period, with a set of progressive checkpoints over time as certain management conditions are met and stock health hopefully improves. Target 2 and 3 are structured a little bit differently, with pathways determined by a company's position in the supply chain. Companies with impact from their direct operations, so fishing or aquaculture companies, are required to take the operations pathway for target 2 and are encouraged to also set engagement targets, while companies downstream at the middle or the end of the supply chain, such as retailers, will set engagement targets, though if possible, they should work with their suppliers to also make operational improvements on fishing vessels or at the farm level. Through target 2, companies are committing to improving operations in fishing or aquaculture to standards of best practice in order to prevent habitat degradation. Or they're engaging in initiatives that restore or protect critical habitats that are relevant to their seafood supply chains. Indicators for this target can be more varied than for target 1 because it covers pressure from both aquaculture and fishing operations and a variety of habitat types, from coral reefs to seagrass beds to mangroves, and a variety of pressures such as pollution and physical damage to habitats. Companies will need to determine the state of nature for habitats that they're operating in or sourcing from, but this target mainly relies on pressure indicators related to externalities like habitat conversion, degradation, or pollution, and adherence to standards of best practice in their operations. Target 3 will help companies reduce risk to endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife, and is developed by examining the spatial and temporal overlaps between fishing activities and endangered marine wildlife populations, as well as the risk that fishing gear poses to relevant species. And here we use risk as an indicator, given the lack of data tracing specific seafood commodities and products back to observed known interactions between fishing and aquaculture and marine wildlife. Similar to the previous target, companies will use either an operations or an engagement pathway, depending on their position in the supply chain. However, target 3 also contains a third pathway where, similar to target 1, companies may be directed to cease sourcing from certain fisheries. For this target, that cessation would be called for in limited cases where there is known interaction with critically endangered marine wildlife in a fishery where management does not include monitoring or mitigation measures related to human-wildlife interactions. And with that, I will toss it over to Alice to discuss target pathways a little bit more and our approach to engagement.
Thanks, Taylor. So yes, as Taylor was saying, each of our targets contains several different pathways that will allow a company to set the targets dependent on a company's position in the supply chain and also dependent on the state of nature where that company is sourcing seafood in relation to the thresholds of each target. This is a list of the different pathways within each target. And we've kind of color-coded them based on how they relate to each other. We have written this guidance to have consistency in the type of pathways across all of the targets for ease of use with the companies and to allow for coordination of action across different target setting operations and across different regions of seafood sourcing. So the different types of target pathways available are operations pathways, whereas if a company is a direct operator or has access to working with the direct operator, which would be the actual fishing company or the actual the aquaculture operations, and can actually make changes to the operational environment where there is seafood sourcing, the actual impact sites from seafood sourcing and direct production. There are also, in certain cases where thresholds have been exceeded in by extreme amounts, a cessation pathway, where it is deemed that other interventions are not sufficient. But in most cases, as you can see, the most common type of pathway includes engagement. There's also reduction if a small and temporary reduction in sourcing is necessary, but engagement is the primary pathway available across all of our targets. I want to talk a little bit more about what an engagement pathway means for a company. So this is the primary theory of change within the Ocean Hub's guidance document. And engagement pathways allow companies to commit to engage in what we broadly refer to as improvement initiatives at a seascape level or a jurisdiction level, kind of a regional level, that contribute to achieving target outcomes. And those target outcomes are directly related to what Taylor was just speaking of, which is improving stock health, protecting habitats, or reducing risks to endangered, threatened, and protected species. Now, what do we mean by improvement initiatives? And this is where, as Taylor was just discussing, we really believe we are contributing to and a space that is really well founded of really strong commitments, initiatives, and certification space in the seafood environment. Improvement initiatives can be things like seeking certification, fishery improvement projects, aquaculture improvement projects. They can be the kind of newly evolving jurisdictional initiatives. They can be advocacy initiatives. They can be restoration initiatives. Anything that leads to the desired target outcome that a company is setting under any of those three targets within the guidance. And there's a lot of flexibility in the types of initiatives chosen, as long as the target outcome is the goal of the initiative that a company can join or participate in or even create in the regions that they are sourcing from. And that is really the theory of change, is to have companies engaging in the regions they are sourcing from to see improvements. What we call this kind of a help first principle, that unless thresholds are exceeded and that require cessation or reduction, and even when thresholds might require a reduction, targets are structured around companies taking actions in the regions that they are sourcing from or operating in the case of direct operators, to improve conditions for species, for ecosystems, for the governance structures, and for communities. This relies really strongly on stakeholder engagement, where companies partner with or engage with the appropriate local stakeholders. These can be scientific bodies, these can be community associations, to ensure engagement is meaningful and will achieve the stated goals. As we've talked about a lot, this can incorporate and build on existing work, so that companies that are already engaged in this type of work can incorporate that into developing their targets. And this is really where companies can get at that crucial work that SBTN is building on, which is restoration, regeneration, and transformation. Currently, this is the pathway where companies can achieve this type of work of restoring marine habitats, of regenerating the marine environment, and creating systems transformation and change to ensure halting and reversing of biodiversity loss in the ocean. And that's really the theory of change that this guidance document and these targets are pinned on, is companies engaging and really ensuring that there is positive change in the regions they are sourcing from, and not just asking companies to change their sourcing behavior, but to engage where they are sourcing from. But again, this is not the only target pathway. So here are a few examples of the type of targets that a company can come out of setting the targets for the Ocean Hub with. we pulled within our guidance document. Throughout the entire process, we have illustrative examples of hypothetical companies having gone through the process and set targets. They are alongside each step of each target to provide a really helpful framework to allow companies to see the guidance in action. And these are some of the examples that we've pulled from our guidance document. So in the top left is an example of a reduction target. If a company is sourcing from an overexploited stock that requires a reduction in sourcing pressure to return to a non-overexploited status, you will see that companies will set a end time to their target and a percentage reduction compared to the baseline date. And companies have the flexibility to choose how they are achieving that reduction, but they are stating what reduction percentage they are achieving. Similarly, there's an operations target, particularly for the habitat protection and risk reduction to endangered, threatened, and protected species. Companies will actually talk about the types of operational improvements they are achieving in this target. You can see here this hypothetical target is about reducing nutrient discharge in shrimp farms. And again, there's a very clear end date set to this. In the top right, we have a cessation target. These are the least common types of targets. The goal is not to have companies need to pull away and stop sourcing, as again, the theory of change is companies engaging and improving in sourcing regions. But in extreme cases, companies may need to cease sourcing if there is a really high risk for endangered, threatened, and protected species, or if a fishery is critically overfished for a period of time and there's no change or improvement seen historically. And there will be a long period of time in which a company is able to prepare for that change in sourcing. And then finally, of course, those engagement targets. A company will be able to engage in local improvement initiatives, and they, in their target, state the goal of those local improvement initiatives, what they're aiming for, and by which date they are aiming to achieve that. So these are the types of targets companies can come up with. There's flexibility, they write them themselves, and they always ensure a clear end date is written in their target. How do companies do all of this? There will be this is a kind of example of all of the resources. This is not just a guidance document that we've produced, although there is a very, very thorough guidance document, as we've said, with examples throughout. We've also created an entire list of supporting resources. We have an addendum document, which is an interpretation of steps 1 and 2. If any of you have read steps 1 or 2, those documents for SBTN at this time were written for terrestrial data and for terrestrial target setting in mind, terrestrial and freshwater. As of right now, it has not been updated for ocean and marine data. And so we have provided this document for how to work through steps 1 and 2 with ocean data in mind. And we've provided that document on the website along with our guidance document. There's also data resources and tools to work through these targets. There's an entire spreadsheet of places for companies to go to find some of this data, to find stock assessment resources, to find habitat data, to find data on endangered, threatened, and protected species. Some of this data can be difficult to source, and we're very aware of that. And so we've provided as much information and data as we can. And we've also provided a suggestion form. So as companies go through this process and they find a new data source that is not on our spreadsheet, they can share it with us and we can upload it. And any other organizations can also upload data. We have a optional scoring tool called the Endangered, Threatened, and Protected Species Risk Assessment Scoring Tool. This is a data-limited scoring tool so that companies can provide a baseline score for their target 3, which can be difficult to do. There's a 1-page overview for decision makers so that you can take what is a lot of very complex information and provide a summary overview to discuss, and also a facts document to hopefully answer some of your questions. And all of this is available on our website. Right, and then finally, so what happens? So all of this, again, really quickly, just want to summarize, as Taylor's already talked about, the goal of this is alignment and interplay within the seafood space, and within the corporate commitment and disclosure space. We have worked very hard as we develop this to ensure this alignment and collaboration with existing seafood standards, certifications, frameworks, and commitment practices, and with the disclosure framework space. With the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, we have aligned definitions for habitats and species within their upcoming seafood, and they're within their upcoming fisheries sector guidance. We have aligned target indicators, and we're going to be working very closely with them on future sectors as well, towards a goal that ocean targets will improve TNFD disclosures. With the CSRD and the ESRS standards, our target metrics are covered in the E2, E3, and E4 standards, and our targets are disclosed under the ESRS. And our goal is ultimately, of course, ocean targets assist in identifying metrics for and improve CSRD disclosures. And then finally, within the seafood certification space, this has really been our goal. We understand seafood certifications are an important part of the corporate commitment space. And target setting can enable certifications, particularly that engagement pathway. And certified seafood is recommended as a key source of improved traceability and data accessibility within the targets. Our goal is that our ocean targets will work with and alongside certifications to increase the support for certifying seafood and increase outcomes for uncertified seafood. So we really want to reiterate this point of alignment and interplay of our targets with this certification space. So with all that being said, we want to talk about what comes next. We will be, as Varsha mentioned earlier, our validation will be performed independently by the Accountability Accelerator for that accountability and credibility of an independent validation process. We will have data submission forms tailored to each target. We've already been in development of these that will make it really easy for companies to understand what data they need to collect and what data needs to be submitted. And like all processes within SBTN, companies must first have SBTN Step 1 and Step 2 completed to have ocean targets, which is Step 3, validated. And this ocean targets validation is not, if you have been in the SBTN space, validation for Step 3 for freshwater and land just rolled out about a month ago. That has not been the case. That was not inclusive of ocean targets yet. That will be coming later. But if you are interested in ocean target validation, we do have an expression of interest form. So on the next slide, I can talk a little bit about that. If you are interested in being one of the first companies to set Ocean Hub targets, we would really like to hear from you. There is a way for you to express that interest. We have a very simple form. It's very easy to fill out. It's also not a commitment to set targets. So you can fill it out to hear more, to say that maybe you're interested in learning more about what that would mean and considering it. Very simple form. You just fill out your information. We can get in contact with you as we are developing what this initial cohort will look like. It's no dates at this time. It's just an expression of interest, and we're really interested in hearing from companies that would like to be the first to set these targets moving forward. So we'll be dropping this link in the chat. It's a very simple form, and we're really hoping to hear from companies that would like to be the first to set Ocean Hub targets. So with all that being said, there's a few things you can do moving forward. We have, of course, the expression of interest form that will be posted up. And as you said, you need to have steps 1 and 2 completed to do Ocean Hub targets. So if you have not yet, you can get started on steps 1 and 2, especially now that we've completed that addendum document that helps interpret steps 1 and 2 for the ocean. And please check out our guidance, read through it, and get a full understanding of what ocean targets might mean for you and your company. And so with that, we can take a couple of minutes to wrap up questions, make sure that we are answering as many questions as we can. And any questions that we are not able to answer today, we will keep track of, we will log, and we will answer afterwards and send out answers to all participants after the webinar. So thank you so much. Big thank you to Varsha and Taylor as well, and everyone who is participating in bringing this webinar to life. And thank you all so much for coming and listening to learn more about the Ocean Hub targets.
Wonderful. As we wrap up, we had a few really good questions, and I want to highlight one of those and offer the opportunity to Alice and Taylor to respond. So some folks have asked us about marine data availability and some of the challenges around applying the ocean targets. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what kind of data companies can use to set the ocean targets and some of the alternatives that have been provided in challenging situations in terms of data availability.
Yeah, it's a great question. As I mentioned, we're not ever going to not acknowledge that data accessibility can be a huge challenge in the ocean, as the question acknowledged. So for each target, there's a slightly different requirement for data. Target 1 requires a stock assessment or some understanding of the stock health that is being sourced from. Most commonly, that will come from a regularly assessed stock assessment. There is guidance within the target chapter on using data limited methodology. However, the target baseline is really based on being able to understand either F, which is fishing mortality, or B, which is kind of biomass. So those are kind of the primary indicators within that target. And that is what we would call the state of nature indicator within there. And then companies also just need to know their own stock, their purchasing volume from that stock. For target 2, for habitat, understanding what types of habitat are within the operational kind of area from a sourcing perspective. For a aquaculture farm, there's actually a bit of a boundary around a aquaculture farm of 5 kilometers. For fishing activity that impacts habitats, which is most often mobile bottom contact, which is like bottom trawling, so there would be basic information about the types of habitat that's there, if it's possible to get information about the extent and quality. But again, we understand that that's very difficult to ascertain. And in that data resources tool that we provide, it's a spreadsheet, kind of a list of resources. We have a variety of places that companies can go to find, based on their location, habitat maps of mangroves, seagrasses, corals, etc. And then finally, for the endangered, threatened, and protected species risk reduction target, it is understanding the overlap of seafood sourcing and the kind of range, both temporally and seasonally, of those endangered, threatened, and protected species. And for those, again, we have a list of, if you're in North America, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, has maps. The IUCN sometimes has range maps. CITES can often have range maps. Like there's a whole range, and we try to provide as many as possible. And also on that spreadsheet, provide a little summary of what region the resource covers to help companies navigate. So it's not just a random long list of resources, but it's actually, this would be good if you're sourcing from Southeast Asia. This would be good if you're sourcing from North America. This is good for aquaculture companies. We try to provide some grounding information within there as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Alice. So it sounds like this is a real challenge, especially in marine systems, but there's a lot that these methods provide for companies to get started right now. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I'd like to ask how these targets are complementary to MSC and ASC. I'm seeing a lot of questions here about that. So Taylor, I don't know if you could voice over the aims to align and the work that's been done there.
Sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we really see SBTN as complementary to certifications like MSC and ASC, other GSSI certifications. We specifically call out MSC and ASC a lot because they were on our steering committee and helped us develop these targets. I think something that we've worked hard to do is figure out where SBTN targets are positioned sort of within the ecosystem. And I think what science-based targets enable companies to do is that by taking actions to meet the targets that companies set, they can help create the enabling conditions that are necessary for getting a fishery or farm certified. So getting a fishery or farm up to that standard of best practice and creating improving conditions in the water, the state of nature, so that farms and fisheries can get certified, and that sort of provides the verification that target has been achieved. If a fishery or farm has already received certification, they may not need to set targets because that specific source is sort of up to the threshold. But SBTN targets can also be applied to the fisheries that are not yet certified and are currently seeking certification. And then I think the other important piece of complementarity is a lot of the data that we're asking for within SBTN is similar to data that is asked for or is collected through the certification process. And so certification reports are a place that companies can go to look for a lot of the data that Alice just talked about.
Wonderful, thank you. We've had a lot of really great questions and we're working to answer those mostly in writing, and we'll be back with responses to some of the other ones that we didn't get to here, but I'll pause here to see if we want to take any more live questions before closing. Okay. Well, with that, thank you everyone so much for attending. A huge moment for the Ocean Hub and for SBTN.